name is Bill Moore. I want to welcome you to the first show, it's called, really, Plain Talk About Life in the Bible, and it's sponsored by Ezra Ministries, Inc., of which I'm one of the directors. Now, what I'm hoping over time, at least the design of the show, is that you will write to us, email us, call us, contact us some way with questions you have about the Bible, maybe questions you have about life and the Bible and how they pertain one to the other, difficulties you encountered with the Bible or with Christianity or with other truth claims about other religions. Any of those things are fair game. If you write to us, I'll do my best to respond in the show and answer those questions. Maybe it will be, if you're a Christian, it might be, how do I witness to other people? Are there proofs for the infallibility of the Bible? And is there any background information you can give me on the history of the Scriptures? Why some books were included and others weren't, and all those kind of things. All those things are questions that we could answer, we hope, easily for you, so that you can better defend your faith. If you're an unbeliever and you're watching such a show, then I would ask that whatever skepticism you have, be tempered with some patience so we can explain it. If we say foolish things, call us on it. But I do expect that you'll find, if you're an unbeliever and watch the show, that you'll become persuaded of not only the historical relevance of the Bible, but its present-day relevance to your life. Those will all be things that I hope we'll tell you later in the show how to contact us, and that you'll do that so that you'll be the main part of the show, and I'll just be the respondent. Now, I want to start tonight by giving you a quote by the famous English poet William Wordsworth, and here it is. Of death and judgment, if I misspell anything, please don't let me know that. I'm not very good at it. Death and judgment, heaven and hell, who oft doth think, must, needs, die well. There. I hope that's right. Of death and judgment, heaven and hell, who oft doth think, must needs die well. Now, I'm going to ask you plainly, because I expected that this would be plain. Of death and judgment, how often do you think of death and judgment? I go to dinner with people every week, business people, even social things, and people will bring up religion or something. And if I ask this question, how often do you think of death? People treat me like I'm a leper. Why? Well, we have this funny idea, don't we, that if we speak about death, that somehow it's going to expedite it. That somehow it's a superstitious thing. It's silly as can be if you think about it. The Almighty already knows the day of my death. He doesn't need me to remind him or about your death. But we all have this aversion to it. I think probably because, one, people tell me, well, Bill, if I think about death, I'm going to be depressed. Well, I don't really believe that. Unless you're an unbeliever, in which case you have a very good reason for being depressed about death. Secondly, people will say, well, how could I be happy if I think about death? If I'm not going to be depressed, at least I can't be happy. I mean, what sense does that make, Bill? Well, I'm going to offer this to you. The only people who can really think about life are those people who have thought about death. Let me say it again. The only people who are fit to think about how to live this life are those people who have thought about their impending death. I read where Ben Franklin said he thought every day about his impending death. Jonathan Edwards, the great Protestant New England preacher, said he went to bed every day thinking about his death. Now, he didn't live a miserable life. He lived a reasonable life. One that says what? Death is certain. If you know someone who's escaped it, please write me and I'll be glad to take note of it. But as far as I know, in my own experience, nobody that I know family member, friend, acquaintance, historical figure has ever escaped death. So I don't plan to escape death. If I think about death, it makes me wonder about the way I live my life today. Hence this idea. Plain talk about life and the Bible. And of course, any talk about life is going to refer to death. It's the flip side. And it's a necessary thing. It shouldn't be something we're frightened of. Judgment's another matter. Nobody wants to talk about judgment. Maybe Wordsworth didn't know what he was talking about. Judgment, even in Christian circles, is something you don't get to talk about today because somehow people today, Christians today, in the majority, not all, but in the majority of Christians want to say, well, Bill, that's very unappealing to unbelievers. Well, frankly, I don't care if it's unappealing to unbelievers. It's what God has produced in the Bible are many, many warnings about judgment. Therefore, I would be remiss if I didn't pass those along to you. Now, heaven and hell. Most people don't want to think about heaven. Nobody wants to think about hell. But Wordsworth says the opposite. Who oft doth think must needs die well. He's saying to be able to die well, peacefully, at ease with what life is supposed to have been and what the afterlife or the next life is supposed to be, you have to think about it in this life. Now, when it comes to heaven, there are always people, when I have an opportunity lots of times to go to dinner with people, and recently I was in another country, really, talking to a guy from Sweden who's now a citizen of Venezuela, and the first thing out of his mouth at dinner was, surely you don't believe any of those things about Christianity. It's all a fable, blah, blah, blah. I have to say, as many times as I've had a chance to discuss this with educated, learned people, this guy's an international art dealer, I'll tell you, they really are poor at coming up with anything that's a viable attack on the validity of the Scriptures. Mostly they make fools of themselves with half-baked arguments, with secondhand information, and it's like really discussing it with a fifth grader. Now, these are educated people, so it tells me that the state of mankind in relationship to its understanding of the Bible is probably at an all-time low. Otherwise, people would make better arguments against it, frankly. But when you talk about heaven, I want to be more heavenly minded. My problem is I'm very earthly minded, and Christians aren't supposed to be. So I need to dwell on getting my affections in heaven where they belong, because that's what I was made for, was to be in heaven, and here only a moment, and hell, which I am very grateful for God's mercy that I don't think I'm hellbound. Now, there's some people who probably think I am hellbound, but I hope they're wrong. There are certainly a great number of people who are hellbound according to the Scriptures, and it would be wrong if I didn't point that out to you. Now, if that doesn't appeal to you as a Christian to point out those things, then I would say to you, you're pretty arrogant, because if God speaks of heaven and hell and death and judgment, who are you to say, well, I have a better attitude towards my fellow man, or I'm going to present it in a different way? I had a pastor tell me, a pastor of a very large church here, not too long ago, said to me, well, Bill, you talk about guilt and shame, and I call them tools of the devil. Well, I'll leave that till another day, but I'm going to tell you something. When a pastor of a church that has several thousand members tells you something like that, it just makes you grieve. He knows better than the Almighty how guilt and shame are to be spoken of. The Almighty speaks of guilt and shame, and they have a proper place in life, and they shouldn't be overweighted, but they certainly shouldn't be underweighted. But this gentleman has eradicated them from his vocabulary. As he told me, he doesn't mention sin. Well, that's another matter. That's the state of Christianity today. Now, I want you to think about Wordsworth, what he said. If he's wrong, if you can agree with him, if you do agree with him, that only those people who think of death and judgment, heaven and hell, really have a grip on how to die well, then I want to ask you the next question, which is, not only how often do you think of these things, but how often do you give any thought at all to your soul's interest? As I said earlier, most people, when you ask them, will say, yes, I have a body, and I'm a soul that really inhabits that body. If you follow that up by saying, well, then what part of your time do you give to the sustenance of your body? They'll say 99%, because they're not really truthful. They usually give 100% of their time and energy to a body that does need nourishment and does need exercise and all those things. And it profits it a little, but the truth of the matter is that body is still going to die. Most of my friends, I'm 57, when you start to get this age, you don't hear well, at least you can't tell whether your wife is to your right or your left, or 30 feet away or 300 feet away. You just hear noise. You have glasses. You're missing a lot of your hair that was so dear to you earlier in your life. Your knees creak. Your feet ache. All of those things. But we somehow ignore all of those messages that God gives us, and we act like if we can just run a little bit more today, that somehow we're going to live to be 150 as if that would be a treat. Decrepit. If you look at your friends who are really later in life, you'll find that many times they outlived what they wish they had, because your body continually breaks down. That's the way that God ordained it, and that's the way it's going to be. Now, I can see spending time with that, but not all of your time. If you really believe that you have a soul, then the next question is, how much time do you give to your soul's interest? If the answer to that is really, Bill, it's 0 or 1% or 2%, it doesn't seem very reasonable, does it? Yet we all do that. I'm guilty of the same thing. We're much more in love with this world. Recently I heard a guy at Moody, Mr. Lutzer, talking about Christian lives and Christian churches as being ships that sailed over the sea of the world, and I think that's a good description of it. We're to be people who live above the world. Christians are in this world, but they're not of this world. We have a citizenship in heaven. At least we're supposed to. Sometimes if you watch my actions, you'd think that I'm all too much a citizen of this world. But I'm no different than you in that regard. It's time for me to change, and we all need to change and do what's in the best interest of our soul. So, following that reasoning, I want you to turn with me to 2 Corinthians. If you don't have a Bible, we'll put it on the screen for you. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 through 21. And I'm going to talk to you about what the Bible thinks is your chief need in this world. Now, if I asked you that, if you were all seated here tonight, and I could say to you, what's your chief need in this world? I don't think anybody would give me this answer, but the Bible's plain. What you need is reconciliation. Reconciliation. Now, some people say, one said to me one time, Bill, that's not even a Bible word. I wish you'd just use Bible words. Well, turn to 2 Corinthians 5, verse 18, and I'll prove to you that this is indeed a Bible word. I'm going to read verses 18 through 21. Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Now then, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Okay, there we have it. We have 4 verses, 5 mentions of the word or variations of the word reconciliation. So you can plainly see it isn't my idea that it's an important word, it's God's idea. God has said it in various forms. God reconciled us to himself. He's given us the ministry of reconciliation. He has committed to us the word of reconciliation. We are God's ambassadors. Why? To implore you, he says, to be reconciled to God.